Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here with just the first half of the notes for section three. We're going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and his successes as president. He is probably one of the most progressive presidents we've had in our history. Now, we should be careful about Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, I think we give him too much credit in how he changed the country, but and there were still a lot of things that he didn't do or didn't accomplish. He gets criticized, but he is probably one of the more progressive presidents we've ever had, and also the savior of football, which we'll talk about that later. The cool thing about this era is that you had a lot of things going along with change in our country. We talked about the muckrakering journalists during that time where they were writing up stories and things to kind of highlight some of the bad things about society. Not necessarily to be like, well, I just want to write something negative. It was just more of like, hey, I see this going on. Nobody's making any changes. Let's write about it. So people like Upton Sinclair researching for a novel in 1904 put a lot of his attention to the stockyards of Chicago, kind of meat packing plants, and Sinclair intended his novel to reveal the breaking of human hearts by a system that exploits the labor of men and women for profits. Basically, using men and women to put them in really bad conditions, working conditions, but also highlighting some of the just the disgustedness of industry and how sometimes they overlook certain regulations or things that should change. But what mostly shocked people in Sinclair's book of the jungle was the sickening conditions of the meatpacking industry. And this is something that Theodore Roosevelt will address and talk about. It really inspired him to really focus on this. And that Roosevelt promised that the specific evils you point out shall, if their existence be proved, if I have the power, will be eradicated. Basically, telling Sinclair that, look, I read your book. I'm definitely going to do something about this. And by the way, your answer to number 12 is The Jungle, because that was the book. Welcome to the jungle. So number 12 is The Jungle. Theodore Roosevelt was not supposed to be president. I mean, here's the thing about this guy. He is going to end up be a pretty young guy. In 1900, he was a very young governor. The young governor from New York was urged to was urged to run from New York. Run from New York was urged to run as McKinley's vice president by the state's political bosses, who found Roosevelt impossible to control. Basically, he was starting to really make a name for himself in New York, and ultimately to a point where he was actually considering running for Senate and then eventually making his way to president. But he was pretty progressive and pretty out there, and I think a lot of the Republicans at that time were basically like, we don't really want this guy in office. So the plot to nominate Roosevelt worked by taking him out of the state office, but Roosevelt stood a heartbeat away from being president, and President McKinley barely served 6 months. And second term, he was assassinated. Roosevelt would ultimately control the government. So let's look about Roosevelt and how he rose to this. He's born in a wealthy New York family in 1858. So he had suffered asthma during his time. He really couldn't participate in athletics early on in his life, but he really wanted to persevere. Really wanted to show that his ability as a teenager, how strong he was, and how he, didn't want life to hold him back. And so he really focused in athletics growing up, and he mastered marksmanship, horseback riding. Went to Harvard College. I believe he was a boxer and a wrestler. I don't know if he played football, but at an early age, we see that Roosevelt rises to New York politics. He makes his way into the New York State Assembly, became New York's city's police commissioner, the assistant to Secretary of the U.S. Navy, grabbed the national attention by advocating against Spain in 1898, and his volunteer cavalry, the Rogue Riders, basically won public acclaim for its role in the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba. And there was a battle in the Battle of San Juan Hill. Um, they were down and out and struggling, and it looked like the enemy was going to push them back. And he encouraged his men, let's persevere, let's move forward, let's go. and he just picked them all. I mean, he didn't literally pick them up, but he picked up their spirits by saying, "Let's charge, let's go after them," and they just kept going and going. Eventually, they just overcame the opposition and won, and it was successful. So, after an aspiring politician, Roosevelt returned a hero and was soon elected governor of New York, and then later won the vice presidency. Yes, he was governor. And here's the thing. They wanted him as vice president to prevent him from running for president, and taking this away from McKinley. And so it was kind of a way to shut him up, basically. Here's the problem, though. In 1901, he becomes the president at 42 because McKinley is shot and is killed. So while in office, Roosevelt still enjoyed boxing, still was boxing away. Almost one of his clients blinded him in the left eye. And then the other day, he galloped 100 miles on a horseback and merely to prove the feat possible. So this guy was pretty tough and didn't get frustrated and kept moving forward in life. In politics, as in sports, Roosevelt acted boldly in using his personality and popularity to advance programs. His leadership and public campaigns helped create the modern presidency, which all future presidents would be measured, citing federal responsibility and national welfare. Supports federal government role in states and do not solve problems. Um, Sorry, my bad. Supporters federal government role when states do not solve problems. Square deal Roosevelt's progressive reforms to protect workers from being victimized. So he was a proponent of stepping in and solving issues. One of the biggest things that he doesn't get credit for is saving football. It really goes back into early into his presidency. Gosh, I want to say it was somewhere right around 1903 or 1902. It might have been around there. But Yale and Harvard got into one of the worst games. It was kind of like one of the it was called like the bloody mess or something. The bloody, I'll have to look it up here for class, but it turned out to be one of the most destructive, bloodiest football games in the history of football. And basically, like they had to stretcher off like 7 players for head injuries, and guys' heads were cracked and skulls were busted open. And so it ultimately led into a big brawl. Blood is flying. It was a big mess, and Yale won the game, and it's primarily the reason why they have the rivalry today with Yale and Harvard in football. Trust me, that's a thing. So Roosevelt brings them in, and he's like, "Hey, let's talk in the White House. I really want to say football. I love football. Let's figure some things out. Like, let's make some rule changes and figure out like, hey, maybe let's kind of do some considering some things." And basically, the head coach of Yale, who was part of the meeting, was like, dude, I helped create the sport. No, I'm not going to make changes. Forget that. We're moving on. Well, Teddy Roosevelt's son goes to Harvard the next year, and he's on the football team. Well, everybody kind of singles him out because it's Roosevelt's son. So they basically clothesline him, and he goes down, and his nose is all busted and bloody. And next thing you know, it gets turns to another bloody mess. Well, throughout that year, wasn't just Harvard and Yale. You started seeing 16 people die, over 100 injuries. I mean, football was getting just awful, and it was getting too dangerous to play. So basically, Roosevelt calls him back in, and instead of going to the Yale coach at first and telling him like, "Hey, let me hear your opinion," he's like, "No, like we have to change your game. Let's figure this out." And basically, Roosevelt came up with some ideas. How about, because at that time, football, all you did was pretty much run the ball, and it was a constant just hitting each other, running into each other, tackling. And so what he does is like, "Hey, let's do the forward pass. Let's introduce the forward pass. You can actually advance the ball by throwing, which means reduce tackles or hits at the line of scrimmage. The other thing is, let's advance it to 5 yards. So instead of just nudging along slowly, you have to make big plays. You have to look for the big play. So that's less contact at the line of scrimmage. And then really kind of pushing towards finding ways to make the game safer. And ultimately, Teddy saved the day, and it worked out pretty well. So Roosevelt's ultimately study of history. He published The first book of his 44 books at the age of 24 convinced him that modern America required powerful federal government. He starts to see that we need the federal government to step in. States can only do so much, but the federal government can do so much more. He says, simple and poor society can exist as a democracy on the basis of sheer individualism. Roosevelt declared, but a rich and complex industrial society cannot so exist. The young president soon met several challenges to his assertion of federal power. We see that he starts going into trust busting, and by 1900, trusts, legal bodies created to hold stock in companies controlled about four-fifths of the United States industries. He comes in, certain trusts like Standard Oil. We talked about this with Rockefeller. We talked about this in earlier in section one. Basically, he's hearing about it. The public viewed this business as unfair with their practices by lowering their prices to drive competitors out. Took advantage of lack of competition, jacked prices up even higher. By 1890, Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, but there's some vague language, and it's really difficult to kind of prove that this was capable. But President Roosevelt did not believe that all trusts were and ultimately, we see that President Roosevelt did not believe that all trusts were harmful, but he sought actions to hurt go after those who hurt public interest. And so, President was concerned of his effort concentrated his efforts on filing suits under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And we see by 1902, Roosevelt made the newspaper headlines as a trust buster when he ordered Justice Department to sue Northern Securities Company, which had established a monopoly over Northwestern railroads in 1904. And the Supreme Court dissolved the company, and Roosevelt administration filed 44 antitrust suits, winning a number of them, breaking up trusts. It was unable to slow the merger movement, which ultimately happened, but he did ultimately help with Standard to kind of get Standard Oil figured out. Hold on just a second. I got to pause here. All right. Sorry about that. Had to get a phone call there. But results Roosevelt basically, administration filed about 44 antitrust suits, and they were able to have some success of bursting up some of those trusts. We do see that. Roosevelt was also a part of trying to settle certain crises, like when it came to strikes, and 140,000 coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike, demanded about 20% of a raise, a 9-hour workday, and the right to organize a union. The operators there refused, and this caused a problem. About 5 months into the strike, the coal reserves ran low. And everybody counted on coal for heat, and this became a problem. So Roosevelt decided to step in, called both sides to the White House to talk. He got really frustrated, though, with the attitudes of the mine operators, and basically threatened to take over their mines if the two sides didn't agree, because the mine operators were like, we don't want to have you deal with this. You don't need to worry about this. This is whatever. Stay out of our business. But he was like, hey, if you don't get this taken care of, you're looking at me taking over your minds, because it was intervening with the life of Americans. And so that became a bit of an issue. So we do see that that Roosevelt would ultimately step in that way and try to help. And so what they did in 1903 is they created an arbitration commission to settle their differences. In 1903, the commission issued its compromise settlement. Miners won 10% a pay hike and a shorter 9-hour workday, but they could not get a union in demand. But it helped settle the strike. Roosevelt also introduced a new principle of federal government and his actions, and this ultimately helped reflect the progressive belief in what was going on at the time, especially with arbitration commission, and now introduced. All right, last slide for part one. We also see that he uses his power for railroad regulation. We see that he is wanting to control certain abuses, like the Elkins Act stopped rebates, sudden rate changes. The Hepburn Act limits the passes ICC to set maximum rates. So he's dealing with rates and with railroads. In 1887, Congress had passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which prohibited wealthy railroad owners from colluding to fix prices by dividing the businesses in given area. Of the Interstate Commerce Commission was set up to enforce the new law, but had little power. So we see 1903, Congress comes in and passes the Elkins Act, which, urged by Roosevelt, made it illegal for railroad officials to give the shippers to receive rebates for using particular railroads, and the public had to be notified of the rate changes. And so the Hepburn Act of 1906 strictly limited the distribution of free railroad passes, common form of bribery, and gave ICC power railroad rates. So we see Roosevelt comes in and had to compromise with conservative senators who opposed the acts. The act, its passage, boosted the government's power to regulate the railroads. So we do see Roosevelt does come in and help regulate and solve some problems that way. All right, we're going to talk in the next time we go over Section 3. We're going to talk about conservation and how much that played a part in his policies. All right, we are done with Section 3, or at least Section 3, Part 1. We're not done totally with Section 3, but Section 3, Part 1.